This is the generation of them that seek his face. This is the generation of them that seek his face.
Shabbat Shalom, bienvenidos. Want to welcome each and every one of you that are here, and those of you that are coming in through our YouTube channel and our Facebook. And so we want to thank each and every one of you. Today, we are looking at Lech Lecha. Which in Hebrew, Lech Lecha, means go forth for yourself. Go yourself out. And it is in Breshit, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 17:27. And our study outline, of course, every week I want to give you a study outline. And it is 8 points. Again, as always, these are like 8 sermons, 8 different sermons. And so we try to give an overview rather than focus on a different teaching. I want to give an overview so that you could go home and study more on these ideas. And so again, this is from the call of Abraham to covenant and circumcision that he is given. Now, in the garden, remember we've been talking about the Garden of Eden, and we said that Eden was the name of the continent. Science calls it Pangea, but Eden was the name of the continent, of the one landform. And in that continent of Eden, Adonai planted a garden in the continent or the landmass of Eden. And in the garden, he puts the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I want you to see this tree motif, and we're going to be looking at the tree motif, a tree. From the first 2 trees, of course, there was trees all over the Eden, and in the garden he planted many trees, but in the middle he planted these 2 trees, and we looked at that theologically. But Adonai has used trees to, in a sense, as a motif for believers and unbelievers. And in a sense, the tree of life in Genesis and the trees of life in the book of Revelation and Jeremiah 11:16 and Romans 11:16, as we see the olive tree of Israel, we were going to look at trees as a way to bring us to our identity. Now, of course, we know that Adam ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He ate of the fruit of it, whatever that fruit was. He ate of it in disobedience to Adonai. He ate that which Adonai said, do not eat, for the day you eat of that, you shall die. Now, we know that we are what we eat. If we bring into our bodies and eat fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds, we become nourished and are healthy. If we eat junk food, then the junk food affects our organs, affects our life. We are what we eat. We are healthy or unhealthy by what we eat. Well, our father Adam ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that brought death. And so that death we have all inherited. And so we partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in a sense, we see that Adam and his descendants became a wild olive tree. And they became this wild olive tree that we see from Genesis 1 through 11. From Genesis 1 through 11, the result of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil made us into what Paul would later use as an illustration, a wild olive tree. Of course, we had Adam and all the situations there with Cain and Noah and the sons of God and the sons and the daughters of man situation. We saw Shem, Ham, Japheth, Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, the Table of Nations, and then the Great Dispersion. All that occurred in Genesis 1 through 11. And later on in our study today, we are going to look at the idea of these Table of Nations and this dispersion that occurred. But think of all humanity post-garden, being kicked out of the garden, being in this shelter, being in this place that Adonai had made a home for him. All of a sudden, Adonai kicks him out of this place. They are sent out of the garden into Eden, and there we have dispersed to where we're at now, to our locations throughout the world. And that's Genesis 1 through 11. This is still ongoing today. There, every one of us was either part of the wild olive tree of the Gentiles or of the broken branches that were cut off from Israel, as we're going to see. There are 10 generations from Adam to Noah. So from the time that we are excluded from the garden, sent out of the garden, to the time of Noah, it's 10 generations. Of course, the world became corrupt. Adonai sent the flood. The descendants of Noah repopulated a post-flood world with what we said, a post-flood geography. The geography that we have now is a post-flood geography. There are 10 generations from Shem to Abram. And so from Shem, the son of Noah, to Abram, we have 10 generations ending with Terah. And Terah, the father of Abram, having Abram, Nahor, and Haran as his sons. Now, Yahweh called Terah from and he went to Haran, which was halfway, but stayed there. Now, what do we know about Abraham's family? It says, "Thus saith Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, your fathers dwelt of old time beyond the river," on the other side, they're in "even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." Terah and his ancestors from the time of Nimrod and all these people, they started serving other gods. And Terah was an idol worshiper and worshipped other gods. And this is who Abraham was. He was part of the old world. He was part of the system in the generations after Noah with his 3 sons. All of a sudden, we have 3 family lines, as we're going to see. And from this is the world populated. And all the world, like before the flood, after the flood, now idolatry comes in. And from this idolatry that comes in, again, Adonai has the idea of separation. And we see a separation of the remnant here. Now, here is Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham and Japheth are polytheists, become polytheists. They start worshiping other Elohim. Terah and his sons before were polytheists, but then through Abraham, he becomes what we would call today the first monotheist. A monotheist means you follow one Elohim. A polytheist means you follow many Elohim. And there's many varieties of polytheists. Some are animists, some have idols, some worship spirit forms, and again, even to this day, there are polytheists all over the world, not just like the Romans or the Greeks or the Hindus that have many gods, but many peoples have different gods, whether they are idols or they're spirits, las animas, even when we call the Kachina dolls and things like that. Throughout the world, we have people that are followers of other gods. And it is at this time that we have the call of Abraham. Now, one of the verses that I would like you all to learn is this one. Say with me, Lech Lecha me'artzecha. This is Lech Lecha me'artzecha. Lech Lecha me'artzecha. And in English, this is arise. Lech Lecha, arise and go for yourself from your land. Me'artzecha is from your land. Lech Lecha, arise and go from your land. And so the call of Abraham, remember, the call of Abraham was the call of a man that Adonai saw in the midst of idolatry, in the midst of serving other Elohim, other gods, in the midst of serving idols. Adonai sees a man, and there's something about this man. You know, a lot of times it's easy to serve or to be a believer when everybody around us is believers. But here is a man, the father of our faith, a friend of Elohim, he's called, that Adonai sees something in this man that he calls him out. He calls him out, and he says to him to leave, arise and go for yourself to a land that I will show you. This moment is the turning point. I call this the turning point in human and world history. In fact, as I see the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, I see Genesis 1 through 11 as the first part of the scriptures. And I see Genesis 12 to the end of Revelation as the second part of scripture. I don't see it as Old and New Testament. I see it as 1 through 11 as a section. And then 12 to even our future, the end of Revelation, as the second part. The first part, Genesis 1 through 11, as we're going to see, is the history of all mankind. Every person ever born their genealogy is in Genesis 1 through 11. Every person. Every Hebrew, every Jew, Israelite, their history begins here in Genesis 12, or I should say it continues because they're part of the ancient world, the old world, and the new world. In a sense, the turning point of world and human history really begins with Genesis 12. I see this separation. That's the old world. That's our history. The history of every culture, the history of every person. But then, because of sin that came in through Adam, because of everything, Adonai, even with his promises of through the seed of the woman, Adonai does something about it. And he does something about the lostness, the sin that came in through Adam and continued before the flood and after the flood. And there was idolatry, and again, before the flood, there was violence and corruption. Adonai decides to do something about it, to start the salvation history, and he starts salvation history with a man, and his name was Abram. Abram means exalted father, and this turning point in human and world history. And of course, Genesis 1 through 11 is the history and genealogy of mankind. Genesis 12 to 50 is the history and genealogy of Israel. By the way, that's how you spelled Israel correctly, with a Y. Salvation, history, and genealogy. And so Genesis is the book of beginnings. The book of beginnings of all human history, and the book of beginnings of Israel and salvation history. We need to get this understanding into our heart. Now, we saw that there was this wild olive tree, but now there's a second tree, what I call a cultivated olive tree in Genesis 12. What Adonai does is he gets Abram, who is part of the wild. Remember, Abram is part of the wild olive tree. Abraham is part of the wild olive tree. And he cuts him off from the nation. Remember, Abraham was not a Jew. He was not a Hebrew. He was not an Israelite. Abraham became a Hebrew. When Adonai cut him off from the nation, Abraham was a Gentile. The word Gentile means nation. He was of the nation of Ur. He was of these Sumerian peoples, Semitic people because of Shem. But Adonai cuts him off from the wild olive tree and cultivates him to be a new tree, a cultivated tree that would produce fruit. And so there we have Abram. We have the command, Lech Lecha. And then we have promises we're going to see today of a land, a seed, and a blessing. We're going to see that Abraham is the first person to receive the gospel. Even though Genesis 3:15 and 16 says, through the seed of the woman, that's what's called the pre-evangelium. That's called the pre-gospel. But here in Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3, we see the gospel, the good news, the salvation of the whole world is promised here in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. We see the blessings and the cursings. We see the word ivrit. Everybody say ivrit. The word ivrit is the word that becomes in Hebrew, Hebrew. The Hebrew word ivrit actually means a river crosser. It's someone who crosses a river, and it's not a good term. Remember, Abraham never called himself the river crosser. He never called himself El Mojao. He never called himself that. That's what they called him. They called him, in a bad way, the guy from the other side of the river. Now, what's interesting is that Adonai used that pejorative term. He used that negative term, in a sense, to bring to Abraham a status that now you have crossed the river, not from the good side to the bad side, but from the bad side to the good side. And from then on, Adonai starts using rivers to cross, to teach us about doing his way. Remember, we crossed from the sea from Egypt into freedom, from bondage into freedom. Then we crossed the river from the other side into Jericho, from the side of the Amorites to what would become Israel. And in a sense, baptism is a sense of river crossing. When you get baptized, it's like crossing the river. Interesting, John the Baptist baptized people where? On the river. And he actually got them when they were coming down from the east side, and he would baptize them as they were going to Jerusalem on the west side. And so crossing a river, ivrit, is very important for us in our salvation history. In a sense, every one of us is an ivrit. Every one of us is a river crosser. Every one of us is one of these persons that was on the other side. Now we're on this side. So when you hear the word ivrit, Hebrew, Abraham the Hebrew he was called. They called him Abraham the river crosser. And again, that's a nice way of putting it. And when they called him that, they said, you're from the other side, you're not from here. But Adonai on the other side told him, go there. And then the last thing about the cultivated tree is the seed. Every tree, every fruit tree has seed. And the seed of the wild olive produces wild olives. The seed of the cultivated is going to produce good seed, as we're going to see. Now, Lech Lecha. Here is a map of Ur. Here is Ur. And this is the Persian Gulf. And many people say this is where Eden was, the garden was. We don't know where. We believe it was Jerusalem that was the garden area. But here was Abram. And again, here is the river. There's Babylon. And they crossed the Euphrates River here at Haran. They stay there for a while. Terah dies at Haran. And then he comes down through Damascus and through the city of Dan. In fact, the city of Dan, the gate, the door that Abraham came in through is still up. It's in ruins, but you could still pass through it. And then he comes, of course, to Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, Beersheba. And so this is called the Fertile Crescent. You could actually see the greenery there through the Fertile Crescent. And so he's from here. And again, he comes all the way down to Beersheba. Here's a closer look at Abraham's journeys also. And not only from Beersheba, but he does go to Egypt, to Tanis. and then comes back. So these are the wanderings of our father Abraham. Now, when we study today's Parsha, we are looking at the foundations of Hebraic faith and doctrine. And I want us to look at that of Hebraic faith and doctrine. These are not the foundations of Jewish faith and doctrine. These are not the foundations of Christian faith and doctrine. Those will come later. These are the foundations of Hebraic faith and doctrine. And these foundations in today's Parsha are the basis of Mosaic, Messianic, and Apostolic ministry. Now, our congregation, and I like to say, I follow a Mosaic, Messianic, and Apostolic ministry or faith and doctrine. Why these three? Why not just Messianic? Why don't you just say you're a Messianic believer? Because I'm Mosaic. I'm not just Messianic, I'm Mosaic. Because I follow Torah. I base my teachings on Torah. I'm Torah based. Of course, a lot of people say, well, we're Torah observant. Well, we're Torah observant to a degree, but there's aspects of Torah observance that we cannot do today, and that's because we don't have a temple and we don't have a high priest and other areas, but we're Mosaic based. We're Messianic because we follow Yeshua the Messiah. I am Messianic because I follow Yeshua the Messiah. And I'm apostolic because I follow what Messiah's disciples and apostles were told and wrote about. So from Genesis to Revelation is our complete understanding. Many people are just Mosaic. In fact, Judaism today is Mosaic and Talmudic. They follow Moses and they follow the teachings of post-biblical rabbis. Many people are just messianic. In fact, the Greek word for messianic is Christian. And many people just follow the Christian ideals. And yeah, they look at Moses for stories, but they don't follow a Mosaic lifestyle. They follow just a Christian, which again, Christianity is post-biblical. Christianity is not biblical, it is post-biblical. What we know of what became the early Messianic community after the death of Yeshua and the apostles, they became what we call the church or churchianity. Many people use that term. And of course, apostolic, many people say, well, you know, in fact, many people follow Paul even more than they do Yeshua, which we're not supposed to do. We're supposed to be Mosaic, Messianic, follow Yeshua, apostolic, follow the apostles in a balanced way. We need to constantly be balancing what we believe here, what we will believe there, because remember, we follow the new covenant. We do not follow the first covenant as it was given. We follow the new covenant. And the new covenant is a renewal of the first covenant. Jeremiah 31:31 makes us understand that. The days are coming when I will make a renewed covenant. Adonai, through Jeremiah, in the Tanakh, promises that he's going to renew the first covenant because the first covenant was broken. The first covenant was broken. So now Adonai renews it, and he renews it by faith and by grace. And so there's faith and grace in the Brit Chadashah, in the new covenant. So I am a new covenant believer in Moses, not a first covenant believer in Moses, but a new covenant believer in Moses. We follow the gospel, the good news of Yeshua, which in the book of Hebrews says we follow a better covenant. The renewed covenant is better than the first covenant. The call, arise, go for yourself from your land and from your kindred and from your father's house. We have a term here in New Mexico. I don't know how close this is to Castilian Spanish, but we have a slang term that says "lejate." Lejate means get out of here. Take off, get out of here, and get away from me. Arise, lejate. And when I was reading Lech Lecha, I was saying, I wonder if that's a Sephardic term or to get away. But he says, go for yourself, or you yourself, you go from your land. And the land was Ur. The land was Haran later on. And from your kindred, de tu gente, from your family, your father's house, take off. I want you to go. Now, what's interesting is that in Ur, later on it became Ur of the Chaldeans, but in Ur there was a lot of idolatry. Deadeye and his family, they were idolaters. Think of it, they were idolaters. But they were good idolaters. Well, how could you be a good idolater? Well, you're a good idolater because when he is sent, I want you to think of this. Think of this. When he is sent to Canaan. Well, wait a minute, the Canaanites. The Canaanites were idolaters, but the Canaanites were bad idolaters. In Canaan, they sacrificed children. In Ur, they were more high class. They would not sacrifice babies, and they would not do that. They would do a lot of idolatry, a lot of the gods, but the Canaanites were gross idolaters. They were involved in all kinds of sexual and immoral practices. And so he goes, like they would say, from the frying pan into the fire. Adonai sends them from the frying pan into the fire. And he sends them from Ur of the Chaldeans, from idolatry into gross idolatry. And it is there that Adonai is going to make him to be the man that will initiate the salvation history that will end in Yeshua and what Yeshua did for us. So be thinking of all this as we talk. Arise, get out of here. Leave your people, leave your family. By the way, he was supposed to leave everybody behind. And in this way, Abraham, like every one of us, well, a little compromise. Remember, he brought Lot. And Lot turned out to be a problem for Abraham and for the world after with Sodom and Gomorrah and the descendants of Lot. But that's another story. The foundation of a faith lifestyle. He says, unto the land that I will show you. By the way, he takes off without knowing. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed the call and set out for a country that was the inheritance given to him and his seed. And that he set out without knowing where he was going. Now, in the English, it always uses the plural. But, as we're going to see, the Hebrew is a little bit different. He set out without knowing where he was going. It's like Adonai says, okay, I want you to pack your car, pack it with food. I'm going to send you out. Where are we going? Where do I put my GPS set to? Just start going. Where? Well, just take off. And I'll tell you where to turn. I'll tell you where to stop. I'll tell you where to go. Would you trust someone saying, hey, we're going to go, where are we going? I don't know. We're just going to take off. Sounds a little, but that's faith. It was by faith. It wasn't by, well, I want to know all the details. I want to know this. Why? Why are we doing this? How are we doing this? What are we doing? It was by faith that Abraham, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, we see in verse 1. This country that he was going was an inheritance. Now, when you think of an inheritance, you're in Ur of the Chaldees, and Ur of the Chaldees was a pretty built-up city. They had big malls and big temples, and it was a beautiful, laid-out city in those days. And think of it, he's going from, it's like going from, New York City, LA, someplace that's like that. It's to, Cuba, New Mexico, or something like that. Someplace that it's nowhere land. And Adonai that's your inheritance. Wait a second, I thought I was going to inherit these big giant things. No, you're just going to inherit a little casita over there. You're going to, instead of living in all these nice homes in Ur, you're going to live in tents. What? So it seems downward, but Adonai is actually doing something that's going to raise him upward. Here we have the seed and the blessing. And I will make you, over here, E'asecha legoy gadol. You heard me say, anybody heard me say that when I was reading the Torah scrolls? Legoy gadol. The word goy is nation. Gadol is great. I will make you a great nation. From the nations, from being a Gentile, I'm going to make a special nation, an exalted nation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And so Abraham was taken from the Gentiles and became the chosen, set apart, holy nation that was to become Israel, the Israel of Elohim. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great. You are to be a blessing. People of the world are going to be blessed by Abraham. What is that blessing? The blessings and inheritance of Abraham. Now, this gets us into what we call the Abrahamic Covenant. And Adonai gives it to him in spoken form here. And then later on, we're going to see that Adonai puts it in sacrificial terms. The three promises of the Abrahamic blessing are the land, the seed, and the blessing. Leave your land for a land that I will show you. And I'm going to give you a seed. I'm going to give you a seed. I'm going to give you a descendant. And I'm going to make you a blessing. Now, this covenant is unconditional. The Abrahamic covenant, unlike the Mosaic covenant, which is conditional, the Abrahamic covenant to Abraham and his seed is unqualified. It's unilateral. Unilateral means it's only one way. It's not two-way. It's not a two-way covenant. It's a one-way covenant. In other words, Adonai makes this covenant and only he is liable. Only he is liable. It's literal, it's grammatical, it's historical, and it's eternal. It is for always, it is forever. So the promise of a land, seed, and blessing is unconditional, literal, and eternal. That's why we need to go according to the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant is a parenthesis covenant for Israel and those that are grafted in. And when he makes the new covenant is also based on land, seed, and blessing. And the new covenant is also unconditional, it's also literal, and it's also eternal. Whereas the Mosaic covenant, as a parenthesis covenant, is going to end at one time. Can you imagine in eternity, are we going to be doing all those things in eternity? No. Are we going to be sacrificing eternity? No. We're going to have a temple in eternity? No. All those things are not eternal. But the Abrahamic covenant is the promises and unconditional, literal, and what? Eternal, like the new covenant. Now here's an idea of the Abrahamic covenant so that we could just stick this into our mind. The Abrahamic covenant is for a land, a seed, and a blessing. Now notice that the land part of it is given to Israel in Deuteronomy 30. The seed is reiterated in the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7. And the blessing is reiterated in the new covenant of Jeremiah 31:31. So in the Tanakh, the Abrahamic covenant of a land, seed, and blessing is reiterated so that Israel could know that this covenant is for them, not just one time, but many times he says it. Now, here's the first gospel. The first time the gospel is, this is why I love this parsha, because this is the first time we hear the gospel. Genesis 12:3 says, "And I will bless them that bless you, and curse them that curse you. Those that curse you, I will curse. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed." Now let's go on through that. Bless those who support Abraham and sons. Curse those who slight Abraham and son. Now, anyone who blesses Abraham and his sons, and anyone who curses Abraham and his sons, or son, will be cursed or blessed. But we're not talking here just physical. I'm going to introduce a concept here that many people might not like, but I'm going to introduce a concept here that if you're a spiritual son of Abraham, not his physical seed, not genetically, but you've been grafted in and you are part of Abraham, this applies to you too. So if someone curses you, if you say, I'm a Gentile, but I believe in Yeshua, I'm baptized in Yeshua, and somebody curses you, they'll be cursed. If somebody blesses you, they'll be blessed. Because you are a son of Abraham, then you are part of what Abraham inherits. And that's an inheritance. That's an inheritance. If Abraham is cursed and Adonai curses them, if someone blesses Abraham and Adonai blesses them, that's an inheritance for his sons. And if you are baptized into Yeshua, then this applies to you. And it might not apply to a person who's Jewish who's not following Yeshua. I know I'm going to get some flack for that, but I believe that's true. How do I know? And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Let's look at this. this covenant blessing is about the gospel. But watch what it says here, not only to Abraham, but to Isaac and Jacob. And all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So in these 4 verses to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Yaakov, the same covenant blessing of the gospel of being blessed in him, in the seed. Him is the seed. Who is the seed? Who are the descendants? Who is Abraham's seed? Is it the Jewish people? Who is Abraham's seed? Is it the Gentile Christians? Yes and no. Yes and no. It is the Jewish people who followed in the way of Abraham and Moses and Yeshua. Because salvation came by faith in following Abraham, salvation came by faith in following Moses, and salvation comes by faith in following Yeshua. So anytime you cut yourself from Abraham, from Moses, or from Yeshua, you cut yourself off from being Abraham's seed. What about the Gentile Christians? Just because you're a Gentile Christian doesn't mean that you're part of the descendants of Abraham. You know, just because you were born in a garage doesn't make you a car. Just because you're born in a church or follow, do this or that, doesn't make you a believer, doesn't make you part of the olive tree of Israel. So Jewish people and or Gentile people who follow Yeshua are Abraham's seed. Jewish people or Gentile, even Christians who don't follow Yeshua, are not part of Abraham's seed. They get cut off. Jewish people get cut off. Remember, Jeremiah 11:16. A beautiful olive tree was Yahweh's name for you. But with the roar of a fire, he's going to cut you off and you're going to burn. That's Adonai through Jeremiah telling Israel, if you are part of the olive tree of Israel and you do not follow, he's going to cut you off. In the same verse in Romans 11:16, he says that there are cut off branches. And Gentiles could be grafted in. By the way, Jewish people have to be regrafted to the olive tree of Israel. Any Jewish person that wants to be saved, he is cut off from Israel. He has to be regrafted. A Gentile has to be grafted in. Now, Galatians 3:8. Go with me to your Bible in Galatians 3:8. And the scripture foreseeing that Elohim would justify the Goyim, the Gentiles. Look at that. The scriptures foresaw. The scriptures foresaw. They prophesied. They predicted that the Gentiles would be justified, would be saved through faith, preach the gospel in the beginning to Abraham, saying, in you shall all nations be blessed. So think of that. Exegete this verse carefully. In you, when Adonai says to Abraham, in you, Abraham, in today's Parsha, in you, Abraham, all the nations are going to be blessed. Adonai was preaching the gospel to Abraham. That's the gospel. All goyim will be blessed through Abraham. By Abraham's faith, and if we follow that same faith, the faith of Abraham, the man of faith, will be blessed. Now the promises were addressed to Abraham and his seed. Look what Paul says here. Now the promises were addressed to Abraham and his seed. Notice, in passing, notice the words were not "and to his descendants" in the plural, but in the singular, "and to your seed," which means Messiah. Boy, this verse is so full, so pregnant of so much theology. The promises were addressed to Abraham in his seed, in your seed, in your seed, in your seed, in him. Remember, we read those to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. All three of them received the same promise. And Paul here in Galatians 3:16 says, yes, these promises were addressed to Abraham and his seed. But notice, Paul, remember I said it's grammatical? And so Paul is getting into the grammar of that verse in Hebrew. Now, if anybody knows the Hebrew of that verse, it's Paul. I'm sure he studied it many times with Gamaliel. And Paul says, wait a second, let's have a little grammar lesson here. Notice that it's not in the plural. It's not to descendants as many, as all these sons and daughters and grandsons and great-great-grand, to today's Jewish people. No, it's not to those descendants. It's to a singular descendant, to a seed. And Paul says, and this is Messiah. So when Abraham is told, in your seed all the nations will be blessed, what Abraham is actually being told, in your greater son, your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Yeshua, who will become the Messiah, he is the seed, and through that seed, all the nations will be blessed. So every Gentile nation, including Israel, the Goy Gadol, and all the other Goyim, salvation comes and blessing comes. As it said in 3:8. The gospel was preached. In you, all the nations will be blessed. And this promise was to Yeshua. And it says the scriptures foresaw that. In other words, Adonai foresaw it and predicted it, and he made it happen. And he used this man, this Gentile, from Ur of the Chaldees, called him out, set him apart, made him a Goy Gadol, and through his seed, Yeshua, all the nations will be blessed. Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said, I give this country, this land, to your seed. And there Abraham built an altar to Yahweh, who appeared to him. To whom does the land belong? The land of Israel belonged to Messiah, Yeshua. It doesn't just belong to the Jewish people. It belongs to Messiah, Yeshua. And through the new covenant, and by the way, there's going to come a time when Kol Israel will be saved. All Israel. Because remember, Adonai has not done away with Israel. Adonai has not done away with Israel. Yeshua was of Israel. Paul was of Israel. Paul says, would he? No. Elohim forbid. It is through Yeshua that Israel can be saved. That's why we are constantly told, to the Jew first. Preach the gospel to the Jew first. That's why we are told by Paul, I have this burning thing in my heart, this for Israel to be saved. Because the promises were also through them, through Israel, and today through the Jewish people. Not only for the Jewish people, but through the Jewish people, but for the world. One of the problems that we have, a lot of people think that everything is, and Israel got to the point that it's about us, no, it's not about you, it's through you for the world. Elohim so loved the world. Because the world is lost. Not just the Jewish people are lost, but the whole world is lost. Every Gentile is lost. And we need Yeshua. Israel needs Yeshua. The Jewish people need Yeshua. The Gentiles need Yeshua. For all of you who are baptized into Messiah and clothe yourself with Messiah, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor freeman. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. So because we have clothed ourselves in Messiah by baptism, now we also do become the inheritors of the promises of Abraham. And if you belong to Messiah, how many of you belong to Messiah? Then we're not talking just about Jewish only. Yes, Jewish. Yes, Hebrew. Yes, Israel. But if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, the heirs according to the promise. So as a baptized believer, you are the inheritors of the promises given to Abraham. By the way, if you're not a baptized believer in Yeshua, if you're not a baptized believer in Yeshua, then you cannot inherit the promises of Abraham, even if you call yourself a Jew or you call yourself a Christian. Christianity and Judaism, these two religions, just by the fact that you are Jewish, whether it's genetic or religious, or you are a Christian, Jewish or Gentile, but a Christian, but you are not, and again, like we always say, it's not just having the title of Christian, but being a believer that gives you inheritance with Abraham. Now, we go to Melchizedek, and we've just running out of time Let's just go through this. Of course, Melchizedek was blessed. Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Ay, ay, ay. The divine promises and covenant. Let's go to Genesis 15:1, and we'll just do a little survey of here. Here's where the actual covenant takes place. It happened sometime later that the word of Yahweh was spoken to Avram in a vision. Have no fear, Avram. I am your shield. I am your magen. Magen is a shield. I am your magen. And your reward will be very great. Adoni Yahweh, he says, my Adoni Yahweh. What do you intend to give me? I go childless. See, you have given me no seed. Some man from my household might be my heir. In verse 6, Abraham put his faith in Yahweh, who counted this as making him justified. Now, what faith did he put? Well, the faith that he put is that you will have a son. Look up to heaven. Look at the stars. You're going to have many descendants. And again, those descendants are not just genetic descendants, but as we read from Galatians, anyone who is baptized into Messiah, Yeshua, and identifies with Yeshua and has received justification, now is a son of Abraham, and you are one of those stars. When you look at the stars, you look at the same stars that Abraham did. He looked at those stars, and when he saw all those stars, the Milky Way, and just so much in the darkness, the dark sky of the desert, and he saw those, and in a sense, he saw you, because you are one of those stars, because you're baptized into Yeshua. And not only did he see all his physical descendants of the 12 tribes of what became Judah, the Jewish people today, who are believers in Yeshua, but every person of faith that has put his faith, when Abraham saw that sky, he says, look up to the sky. Look to the heavens. Count the stars if you can. Such will be your descendants. Abraham put his faith in Yahweh. I believe, even though I go childless, even though I'm 99 years old, I believe. And Adonai justified him. Go, that's faith. You're going to have a son, that's faith. Abraham was a man of faith. That's why he's called the father of faith also. And so Adonai, again, to make a long story short, tells him to take a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. He brought all these, cut them in half, put them on one side and half on the other side. But the birds do not cut. Birds of prey came, but Abraham shoot him off. Now, when the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and terror seized him. And so what happens is he does a covenant. Covenant always demands blood. And he cut these two in half. And what they would do is both parties, when you made a covenant with someone, I made a covenant with you, brother, and we would cut these animals, and I would walk, and my feet would get bloody. And you would walk, and your feet would get bloody. And we would say, may this happen to me and more if I break the covenant. and the other person does the same thing. But in this case, Adonai makes a covenant with Abraham and then tells Abraham, lay them aside, and he shoos the birds away that were coming. And then all of a sudden, he falls asleep in terror. And while he's asleep, this is what makes it unconditional. This is what makes the Abrahamic Covenant, because he was asleep during the covenant. During the making of the covenant, he was asleep. And then, know for certain, Adonai tells him while he's sleeping, know for certain that your descendants, plural, will be exiles in a land not their own. They will be slaves and oppressed, but I will pass judgment on that nation, Egypt. And after many years, you will leave with many possessions, and you will be buried at a ripe old age. And when the sun had set, think of it, when the sun had set and it was dark, there appeared a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passing between the animal pieces. There was a what? There was a fire pot. The fire pot, I have that fire pot right there, broken. That's a fire pot. That's a pilot light. That's an ember pot. And what they would do, the father would have this ember pot. And from that ember pot, they would light all the lights. And that pot was always at the front door, always on, and they would feed it all the time. And when his son would be married, he'd get from that ember pot and start a new fire for his son. And when that son grew up and his son got married, they would get, and this is the symbol of the father. So the father passed through this fire pot. But then, all of a sudden, a flaming torch passed. All of a sudden, two people have to pass. Abraham is asleep, and the father passes. He's the fire pot. But all of a sudden, the flaming torch, that's the pre-incarnate Yeshua, passes through the animal pieces, and a covenant is made. And this covenant is the beginning of what will become Pesach, and the beginning of what will become Yeshua's last Passover. And from that Passover, what is for us. And again, there's so much. Again, to your seed I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. So Israel is not just this little, especially West Bank area that's so-called on the West Bank, and with all these other Palestinian, no, it's not even to the Jordan River. It's Jordan. It's all the way to Iraq, Lebanon, to the Wadi of Egypt. All these contested lands belong to not Israel, but to Messiah, to the seed. They all belong to Yeshua and to his descendants, the seed of Abraham, which is us. Again, Abraham is 99 years old. He's called El Shaddai, Elohim Almighty. Adonai changes his name from Avram, exalted father, to a father multitude. Again, we can't do that olive tree prophecy now. Circumcision, it's a mark of ownership. We could talk about all these. The cultivated tree of Israel. Abraham was cut off from the wild olive tree and cultivated to produce fruit. Remember, he was a wild olive. And Adonai cut him off and cultivated him to produce fruit unnaturally, as Paul says. Gentiles also are cut off and grafted, cut off from the wild olive and grafted into the cultivated tree of Israel. Jews are regrafted into the tree of Israel. Not all Jews are Israel, even though they're genetic. A Jewish person that is cut off, that does not believe in Yeshua, is cut off from Israel. They have to be regrafted. They have to be born again also, like a Gentile is grafted in. There's, again, so much. Let's go ahead and stand before Adonai. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to be here. And Father, as we give this raw materials to your people, that they might go home and study to see if these things be so, that they might make a dish of what was given to them, Father. And I pray that your Ruach HaKodesh might just do a mighty work among everyone, especially those that are listening to us by YouTube. Our Jewish friends that are listening to us by YouTube. That, Father, bring salvation to Israel, to my Jewish primos. Bring salvation to my Jewish family, to our Gentile families. In the name of Yeshua. Yevarechecha Yahweh va'ishmerecha. Ayid Yahweh panav elecha v'chunecha. Asa Yahweh panav elecha v'yasem lecha. Shalom. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May Yahweh lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a good day.
Shalom, shalom. Welcome to Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries. Thank you for joining us on our channel. If you have enjoyed this teaching and would like to see more, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so that you can be notified when we have new videos. If you would like to support Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries, please visit us at olivetreefellowship.com or TorahUnleashed.org. We thank you for your past support and hope to continue with you. Shalom, shalom. Have a good day. Shalom, shalom y bienvenidos a Olive Tree y a la Torah desatada. Les doy gracias a ustedes y a Adonai por su apoyo que nos han dado aquí. Y si quieren continuar a hacer una donación, pueden ir aquí en TorahUnleashed.org o en olivetreefellowship.com y ahí pueden dar una donación. Su apoyo, su ayuda es importante en estos días. Shalom, shalom.